Well, hello there. This is Zoe Routh. I am your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership expert. I'm a team navigator. I love to work with leaders and teams to help them explore new horizons. And today's theme, from the theme of our quarter, which is leading change, and particularly around creativity, what I want to challenge you with is big ideas for everyday leadership. Do you want some of that? Of course you do. All right, let's dive in.
Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
So, some announcements to kick us off. The Olympus Project, my very first novel, which has also got plenty of leadership themes within it. It is not a fable, it's not a parable, it is an actual novel. And it's a near future science fiction novel about looking at what kind of world are we facing and how can we respond as leaders to contend with these issues. It's full of tension and challenge and new ideas. So there will be a little bit of a preview at the end of today's solosode, where Christina Percival, who is the narrator for our audiobook, who did the production with Audiobooks Radio, that's my audiobook producer, I'm giving you chapter 27 as a special extract at the end of the show. You should also know that the collector's edition, available only on my website, if you click on zoerouth.com, click on books, and there's the Olympus Project, you can still get the collector's edition, which will be personally signed by me, hand-wrapped, lovingly gifted, and popped into the mail for you when you order it. There's only 100 of them, and quite a few have gone already. There's still some available, though, so do hop on board and get your collector's edition. The ebook will be available at the end of November, and the audiobook will be released the first week of December. Next announcement, we have a free event coming up. It's called How to Get Your Team to Think More Strategically. If I hear many complaints from leaders, and this is one of the big ones. It's, if only my team would actually get their heads out of the detail and start to think more broadly than their own little patch. How can they start to think more collegiately, more collaboratively, and get a whole sense of the organization? Well, this event is for you if that is something that you are working on and want some solutions for. We have a webinar that's on the morning of Wednesday, the 13th of October. That's Australian Eastern Standard Time. And we have a live event in Canberra on the 14th of October. And you can find out all the details and sign up on the website at zoerouth.com. Click on programs, click on events, and the detail will be right there. Would love to see you there. It'd be fun. Yes, live events are happening once more. And it's with the live events and meeting with clients in person where some of the big ideas are coming from for this week's solosode. The first one is really thinking about creativity. I've run a number of sessions with different organizations and different teams where there's this reluctance to consider themselves creative. It's something that Michael Dixon spoke about earlier in one of our earlier interviews this quarter. And it's people who are afraid. They're afraid. Why are they afraid? The big insight I have, or one of the big insights I have around that, is it has a lot to do with psychological safety. And I give a big hat tip to Timothy R. Clark and his fabulous book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, which one of our listeners actually put me onto. And I think it's one of the best books written about psychological safety. And he says there are 4 stages of psychological safety. He says the definition is psychological safety is when we feel like we belong, it's safe to learn, we can make a contribution, and we can challenge the status quo, all without being ridiculed or undermined or ostracized in any way. So the 4 stages allude to those 4 criteria for feeling psychologically safe. The first one is about inclusion safety. Is it safe? Do we feel included and like we belong? And I think that's a pretty big one. And we spend a lot of time talking about diversity and inclusion. And with Olanike in last week's episode, we talked about equity. It's not just about having different people around the table and including their points of view. It's actually feeling like they belong there and there is a sense of equity across the board. So that needs to be in place first. If we don't have that in place, then we're not going to get creativity coming out of our people at all, because they won't feel safe to share at all if they don't feel included and safe there. The second stage is all about learner safety, and that means people feel safe to test ideas, to run experiments, to fail, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. And the leader has a big part to play in setting up that aspect of the team. So learner safety is really, really important. So do we feel safe to experiment? And I think this is when people's sense of creativity can falter. It may not always be safe in your organization to create something new, to test the waters, because they've been slapped over the wrist for some alleged failure, for some alleged mistake, whether it's had big repercussions for reputation or for some sort of other risk, or it's got financial implication. I think the big one for leaders here is to make sure that there are clear boundaries around the experiments that are allowed. That's one case in point. I think the other case in point for leaders here is to role model their own lessons and insights as they fail forward. They have mistakes and they learn from them. So there's different elements that are important that we set up to encourage people to test and experiment within boundaries, of course. You can't just have free reign on things. So that's one of the limitations around creativity. The next stage is about contributor safety. And this means feeling safe to table ideas, to make suggestions. And there's a couple of different aspects to this. One of them is for the individuals in the team feeling like they have enough knowledge and expertise to actually contribute. Because sometimes we might go around the table thinking that we're being inclusive and say, I want to hear an idea from each of you. And we make sure that everybody says something. And then we get to Tony, and Tony's brand new on the job or doesn't have that much experience, and he fumbles over it because he really doesn't have enough skills and expertise to make a valid contribution. And we have not made it safe for him in that way. So we don't want to deep end people either. So this is a fine line to balance, because contributions from fresh eyes, naive questions are often incredibly valuable. So how do we set the scene to make sure it's okay for people to contribute with fresh eyes, with a naive sense of wonder, even if they don't have the necessary background and experience? And I think we can set that up from the outset. If we assume that everybody's voice is equal in the room, then we can set ourselves up, ironically, for failure around this, because not everybody does feel equal. Somebody sitting next to somebody with 30 years of experience on a topic when you're new to the team can be incredibly intimidating. So we need to facilitate that carefully, making it safe to say everybody's got different levels of expertise and experience here. This is what I will value from each of you, the naive questions as well as the deep, rich expertise. And there are blinkers on both of those, right? So David Robson wrote this great book called The Intelligence Trap, which says we can become blinkered with too much experience because we see the patterns and we jump to conclusions. And I think this is one of the blind spots we can point out to those of us on our team who have heaps of experience. Is like, yeah, you know a lot. There may be blind spots. So there's a blind spot for having expertise, and there's also blind spots if we are a new contributor, where we think this is a brand new idea. Why are not people listening to me? And you table a suggestion, and you get this sort of eye roll thing. Because we haven't taught our contributors the kinds of questions and thinking that they need to put into their suggestions beforehand, especially if they're new to the organization and don't have the experience base. Things like, before you make a suggestion, ask what else has been tried in this area, what might be the resistance to this. So do a little bit of background shopping around. And also to have a process in place about how people can actually make suggestions and what happens to their idea once it's tabled. It's not just tossed off or rejected in hand, if you like, that it actually goes through a consideration process. And there's two parts of the equation with that. So the individual contributor has to do their legwork before they submit an idea, And then the people or persons or process they are submitting to needs to test and go through a rigorous process and close the feedback loop. So that's a pretty big piece of the contributor safety element, and also needs to be in place if we're going to get creativity coming from our people. The next stage, the last one, fourth stage, which is called the challenger safety in psychological safety, is where the innovation piece starts to happen. So when we feel safe enough to challenge the status quo, to challenge sacred cows, that's when we can sort of smash ideas together and allow the new to emerge. You can see there's a lot of steps to get to this point in terms of being respected, heard, valued, having a process that helps us understand how ideas can be tested and developed. We don't just automatically jump to, let's challenge the status quo. It needs to be nurtured and set up and carefully managed. So all this is in the background of why don't people be more creative at work? Because it's scary. If we don't have all this stuff in place, we don't necessarily have the right context. So that's one aspect of why we hold ourselves back. The other aspect, I think, is that we are definitely afraid to fail. And I think failure is not fatal. Failure is fodder for growth. This is definitely a mindset principle that we have to lean into and adopt for ourselves before we ask anybody else to do that. And I think it speaks a lot to our innate human desire to please, to perform, to make a contribution. And so we want to be sure that we can please, make a contribution, and perform before we put something out there. And that's sort of an Achilles heel for us. So we need to change our thinking around this a little bit. So how do we do that? We need to have an experimentalist mindset, experimentation mindset and practice. It's not just that, though. It's not like, oh, I'm going to run some experiments and, I'm going to fail forward fast and the failure is fodder for growth and just sort of wing it like that. I think we need to couple our experimentation mindset and approach with our intention. So what is our intention in terms of trialing something? Is it just testing something for the sake of testing something? Or what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve here? I had an example of this recently. I thought, okay, I want to do something creative. I want to do something dynamic. So that was sort of more self-focused around this particular exercise. I wanted to offer an experience to this group. It was with leaders at the Australian Sporting Commission. We were talking about high-performing teams, and the lesson plan I had was very discussion-based. I'm like, I want to bring this to life for them. I want them to have a really profound, exciting experience where they can get a taste of the joy of high-performing teams. So I leaned on my experiential education background and developed a really fun game. I think it's fun. They did too, actually, called The Odyssey. And the idea here is that they get put into small teams with the intention of you now have to apply your high-performing team's expertise and experience to this particular exercise. And it was a series of initiative tasks following a narrative. And it was really fun. And I was completely nervous about offering it. I'm like, wow. And I thought, the morning before, I'm like, what if I just don't do it? Holding myself back, denying the opportunity for the group to have the experience. This is often what happens to us as leaders. We hold ourselves back because we don't want to disappoint. We don't want to lose face. And in the meantime, we deny the people the opportunity to explore something new alongside of us. And I think that's the bigger failure, I think, if we deny people the opportunity to explore and experiment. And so in that case, this week, the game went really well. It was a success, thumbs up. I've also tried other experiments with other groups where they've been a complete flop. I was working with the Bega Valley, with a group in the Bega Valley Shire, and I offered up a couple of different experiential activities, and my mistake, I realized afterwards, was the equipment wasn't quite right. So instead of really challenging them, they flew through the activities, and it was kind of like bow bow, kind of like, and what was the point of that? I was like, oh, I just didn't set it up properly. So the level of challenge was under their ability. And so that was kind of a waste of time in some ways. So sometimes when we run experiments, they are flops. Luckily, the rest of the session was much more challenging in terms of their emotional challenges that they leaned into. But that's the problem, right? None of us want to feel like this thing that we're trying is going to be a flop. And yet, sometimes they do. Is it fatal? No, it's fodder for growth. So that experience helped me to develop a better game called the Odyssey, which would be more challenging and easier to implement in a conventional boardroom setting. So win. Yeah, hard one sometimes. The other big idea that I've had of recent times in working with clients, and this time it was with the Northern Territory Business Council. I'm running a webinar series for them called the Peak Performance Formula. One of the concepts that's ingrained or integral to that whole notion of peak performance is making sure we know how much is enough. How much is enough? And this concept of enough was first seeded for me in reflection by Peter Cook, my mentor from Thought Leaders. And he talked about this a lot. It's like, how much is enough? Because we can keep playing the game, the achiever game of building a bigger business, getting more team members, getting more clients, earning more income, more and more and more. And more is an addiction of Western society for sure. It is definitely a flagship Achilles heel for the achiever. That's a stage of leadership maturity where more and more and more and more and more is quite addictive. It hooks our dopamine receptors, and we keep wanting to accomplish. The downside of that, which is the trigger often to the next stage of leadership maturity, the individualist stage, and what I call the amplifiers, where we move beyond just creating more in a linear way and start thinking in an exponential way, and not just more to consume and more to produce, but more impact, more influence. So the idea of more and enough is really important. And I think we need to really play with this a lot. So how much money is enough? Enough for what? Enough to meet our needs, enough for us to be comfortable. We should know what enough is so that anything else beyond that is a bonus. I think we also need to define what we need, what we want, and how much is enough. So when we look at our personal finances or our business finances, I think we need to put those lines in the sand. Otherwise, we'd be constantly driving and striving and subtext exhausting ourselves in the effort of trying to get more and more and more. Which leads to the other big question, which is how much effort is enough? How much effort is enough? If there's always more and more, you're always going to need more and more effort. And this is exhausting. So that's one of the reasons why leaders work from sparrows in the morning to owls at night, the 12, 14, 16, 18-hour days, because more effort needs to meet more of a demand. And it's not sustainable. So how much effort is enough? How much effort is enough? And for that criteria, I think all of this comes down to how we define success. How do we define success? It's a question that it's a pretty big question, and I love asking it of leaders because it really challenges what are our assumptions about success. Are they all external markers? It ties into how much is enough anyway. What I've come to work with in terms of success and effort, that relationship there, is I'm having a successful day if I experience the 1% nudge. That is a hat tip to James Clear of Atomic Habits. And he talked about just 1% improvement daily can lead to exponential results later. So we don't need to have a radical transformation every day in terms of what we're doing. If we do these micro improvements, the 1% each day, then we'll set a trajectory towards where we want to go. So for me, that's an important one. So examples of the 1% nudge. In reviewing and reflecting each day, did I eat well in a particular moment where I could have eaten badly? What was my 1% choice in those moments? Did I exercise well when I could have just slacked off? Did I rest instead of drowning in my phone or on social media and distractions? Did I allow my brain to have a little bit of a break instead of always trying to cram something else in? Those little 1% moments. So for me, success is about the 1% nudge on a daily basis. That is way more refreshing than thinking success is when I have consistent revenue of blah, 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 or success is when I fill my programs to XYZ or whatever. Like, we still have goals like that. But if that's the entire recipe of success, then we can find ourselves just exhausted for striving, because there's so many things that go into whether or not our goals are achieved, including other people's decisions and choices and priorities. So if we focus on our effort and knowing that our 1% is enough, then that is a good way to live life. I think it's a much happier way to live life. So that's the second big idea. How much is enough? The first one is failure is not fatal. Failure is fodder for growth. The third reflection is this is a leadership reflection, and to consider what kind of world are we facing and what kind of leadership decisions do we need to make with what we are facing. It's one of the big questions I mulled over when I was writing the Olympus Project. When I was developing this world, this fictional world, which is very much based on the real world, I looked at climate change. What if climate change accelerates? It becomes even hotter. The weather becomes even crazier. The seas rise quickly. What could happen in this world? There were tsunamis. The coastal regions around the planet were going underwater. Islands were getting consumed by the sea. We would have a lot of climate refugees. And it would push people into narrower and narrower strips of land along the coastal areas, because inland would be too hot, especially in Australia. It's already a desert, so hotter means it's too hot for people to live and grow food, etc. So what did this mean? I think, how might we live in a world like that? And in the novel, I play around with, well, there'll probably be an increase in floating worlds. This is already some technology that's existing. So there are design companies that are creating floating cities. And some of the work around Dubai with the creating of their own islands is associated with that. So we might have some floating cities. We might have cities underground to hide from the heat. We might even have undersea cities to save us from the atmosphere. We might have in above ground vertical buildings with green sheaths, like heaving with plant life, which serves as a cooling area, a contributor to adding oxygen to the atmosphere and reducing carbon dioxide, as well as producing food along the way. So this is the world I started to develop in the Olympus Project. And in that world, I thought there's probably going to be an emerging sector of world designers. This you could call architects in some way. World designers are a little bit different in my mind, though, because central to the idea of world designers is how can we design communities and places to live for greater empathy and compassion. In building these floating worlds, underground worlds, undersea worlds, can we design for greater connection and community with people? And in doing so, accelerate leadership maturity so that we can have more people able to contend with the complexity of the issues that we're facing. This is my big concern as a leadership expert, is how can we get more people to understand and navigate complexity? This is central to all of my work. So helping people to be able to understand themselves, the world that we live in, and to be able to make sensible and sensitive decisions in a complex, ambiguous, volatile, uncertain, exponential VUCA world is so important. So in the novel, we talk about that. So how can we actually design communities that can accelerate that? And we bring into play virtual reality. We bring into play places where people can connect with one another and support one another. So that's a little preview of the book. And what, from a leadership thinking takeaway point of view, this is all about encouraging you to do thought experiments like this. And in an upcoming interview with David Matten, he is a futurist and an amazing writer. He writes the blog New World, Same Humans. We talk a little bit about this. How should we navigate this future that may be as dramatic as I write about in the Olympus Project, or will be at least some way partly towards that. I think the first step for leaders is to do these thought experiments. It's like, okay, let's take this to the nth degree. What happens if we need to change our food supply system, which we're seeing right now with the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, disrupting big portions of our food supply system. This is causing huge pressure on how we're going to feed the world. So what can we do to anticipate that, to build resilience into our food production system, say, for example, if you're working in that sector? So playing out with these thought experiments is really important. And I think that's why reading science fiction is so helpful. Good science fiction takes these ideas and takes them to the nth degree and says, how do humans operate in this possible world? We bring all of our strength and all of our flaws with us. So what would that look like? How would humans operate in this context, the good side and the bad side? So a little bit of a preview. I mentioned the wonderful David Matten coming up. We also have Tony Hunter, who is an Australian food futurist, speaking of food, and we explore some of the things that are on the horizon for food production and what it means for you as a leader. Oh, we've also got a great interview with Manly Hopkinson, who is a sailing adventurist. He has led a crew around the world and has developed since then his theory of leadership, which is where compassion is central to it. And he's doing wonderful things with his Compassion Academy. And we have Alice Hanna, who is an Australian leader in people and culture in construction, and how you actually go to brass tacks of building a great culture in a really challenging sector like construction. So that's all what's coming up on the show shortly. I thought I'd also share what I'm reading lately. I'm reading a lot. I read a lot. I'm one of what they call a reading whale. And there's maybe 10% of readers who consume 80% of the books, and I'd be in that 10%. I read a lot. In any case, if you want to check out my reading list, you can find me on Goodreads, which is a readers community where there's book reviews and of different books, and you can connect with authors and that kind of thing. I have my own authors site there. I would love you to follow me on Goodreads. In any case, you can check out my readers profile, and it has a list of all my latest books. I did want to shout out to two books I think were a lot of fun, both sci-fi. One is Shakedowners by Justin Woolley. He's an author from Tasmania. I love this book. It was a fun little science fiction adventure, and it was funny. And Justin says in his bio that he pitched his book to all these traditional publishers, and they went, "Nah, we can't sell science fiction that's funny." And he's like, "Yes, you can." So he went independent. So go the indie authors. I love this little book. I thought it was great, and there's two more in the series, which I'm eager to consume now that I've read Shakedowners. And the other one I wanted to shout out to is an ACT writer. So Roger Wheatley, who lives in Canberra. And his first book, I think it's his first book, I got off his website, called Wolves in White Collars. And it was fun reading a book that was set in my local area. And this is really about two public servants who get bored and want to make a lot of cash. So they decide to steal from a local bikie gang. What could go wrong? Lots. It was so well-paced and so suspenseful. It's not my usual genre of reading at all, and I really enjoyed it. So I've just ordered his latest novel, The Train, which should be a good read as well. So there you have it, Shakedowners and Wolves in White Collars. First one by Justin Woolley and the second one by Roger Wheatley. All right. So that's some of my big ideas for everyday leadership for this solosode. I'm going to leave you now with an excerpt from the Olympus Project, the upcoming release of the audiobook in December. This is chapter 27, and it's read by Christina Percival, who worked with Audiobooks Radio to produce the whole book. Enjoy. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
Chapter 27. One of the delights of human experience is the deep sense of connection we can have with others, if we allow ourselves to be seen. Athena AI, in Wisdom of the Ages. Gaia Training Center, Serena. In her room, Serena stood and assessed her surroundings. Clean, bright, functional. A bed, chair, desk, fitness mat, meditation cushion, and wardrobe for training gear and recreation clothes. Nothing decorative. Each of the trainees had a room of their own for the duration of their training program. A large window drew the eyes outwards to a green lawn. The swaying trees set in a carefully crafted garden were designed to give the impression of no design at all, mimicking a grove one might come across on a stroll through the forest. Though the room was Spartan, the view to the natural world gave the viewer a sense of abundance. Serena felt it expand her spirit as she took a deep breath, watching the wind and sunlight play with the willow leaves. Home. Or something like it. For now. She was used to impermanence. Living in tsunami refugee camps for so long, she knew not to get attached to anything or anyone. Serena grabbed her electronic writer, Gaia issued to all trainees, and sat at the desk. She wanted to capture her thoughts about the selection process before the training began. She knew that if she was going to be one of the final candidates chosen after training for the Olympus Project, she had to be at the top of her game. She needed to figure out the success code, track her achievements and progress. And those of her rivals. Serena jotted her observations of the process. Kept us off guard, threw us in the deep end, challenges pushed group dynamics rather than built them. Interviews were heat-seeking missiles, looking for those soft, vulnerable parts. They'd found hers too. She never felt quite safe anywhere. She'd never really had friends. She had tried. But then the men would go all creepy, or worse, domineering and bullish. And the women, they puffed up like frightened cats around her. Like Xanthi. Xanthi was always a little rough with her. She tried to cover it up, Serena knew. But you can't hide the bitter poison of resentment. It sours the face. Serena had been delighted that Xanthi had joined the Olympus Project selection. She thought it a chance to make amends. Not so. Not yet. Xanthi kept her at arm's length, cold. Serena thought about Xanthi's leadership role. Very directive. Almost too much so. A bit curt, even. Was it just when she was around, though? They had months of training to smooth things out. Then the final choice for building the simulation hub for the tender. A good amount of time to get to know each other. She was glad of one relationship, Xavier. Her connection with the tall Frenchman was a surprise. Serena was focused on the one goal only, get through selection. Her rapport with Xavier sprang up over a meal after the expedition phase. He saw her sitting alone in the dining hall, gazing out to the welcome lawn through a rain-flecked window, the remnants of a salad wilting on her plate. He sat down in a chair across from her and handed her a mug of steaming liquid. She glanced at the mug and then up at him with a questioning expression. Chocolat chaud. Hot chocolate. It's good for endorphins and nervous system therapy. No sugar. Xavier smiled broadly at her. Thought you needed a little lift, judging by the look of you. Serena noticed that he did not seem to get edgy around her like other men. He held his own, comfortable and relaxed. "You make a lot of assumptions," she said, a bit shirty. "I call it how I see it, and to me, you look like a person who needs a little boost. Anyhow, expedition phase is over, so we can relax. Thought it would be good to get to know the future world designers for the Olympus project." "We haven't made it through yet," Serena said in hushed tones. She did not like to get ahead of herself, jeopardize her performance by letting her guard down. She needed to stay vigilant, focused. "Mais vraiment? Really? You're a natural, Serena," Xavier countered. "You have passion. You take on anyone, even that jackass Jonas, with fairness and an even keel." He picked up a spoon, stirred it slowly through his chocolate. "You have spunk." He tapped the spoon on the rim of the mug before popping it in his mouth to suck it clean. He pulled it out again and pointed it at her. "But that's not your real talent." "No?" she asked, perturbed by the pointing spoon. "No. Your real talent is what you keep hidden, deep under that tough, brash exterior of yours that you wear like a samurai." He put the spoon down, leant forward, and said in a conspiratorial whisper, "Underneath all that tough girl act is a soft, warm heart, desperate to love." Serena felt herself holding her breath. Then frightened anger bubbled up inside her. She sat back, arms crossed. "Horse shit. You don't know me from a bar of soap." He was still leaning forward, staring into her face. "Is that right?" He said it slowly, holding her gaze. "What do you want, Xavier?" He said nothing for a moment, scanning her face. "I'm not sure exactly." He sat back and crossed his arms to mirror hers. "But I'm pretty sure it involves you." The tension hung between them like a strand of a spider's web reaching between two distant points. Then Xavier smiled, and so did she. They burst into laughter. Serena smiled at the memory, bringing her attention back to the room and her writing tablet that had shut down as her mind wandered. She started her notes again. Impressions of fellow trainees and world designers. 1. Troy Bruin. Very confident. Talented, proven world designer. Party boy. Who has the hots for Xanthi, that silly little fish? 2. Xavier Consus. Serena paused, enjoying the pleasant thoughts that swirled. Capable. Valuable asset in his horticulture innovations. Ambitious. How ambitious? She wondered. 3. Xanthi Waters, the dictator, likes to be in control. And also, the diplomat, wants everyone to feel heard. Except for me. 4. Jonas Seaborn, engineer bulldozer. As subtle as a sledgehammer, with about as much self-awareness. 5. Gina Castellati, engineer, tough nut. Rogue operator. Hell of a chick. A bird of a feather. 6. David Erickson, pilot. Flies under the radar. Very punny, she thought. 7. Madison Floyd, pilot. Goddess? Gladiator? The woman was fierce. 8. Dr. Muhammad Rashid, physician. Kinda creepy and reserved. 9. Dr. Pierre Martin, life support technician. Opinionated technical expert. And the man she needed to beat. Serena couldn't believe it was her and Pierre as the last candidates for life support tech. They'd beaten out Max, hardcore international explorer. Such an arrogant prick, she thought. He was so ungracious when they'd met up in the common room and the trainee list was published. Serena comforted Jade, who was quietly weeping her disappointment in a corner. Max strode in and stood feet spread, hands on hips, glaring at the notice board. "This is complete bullshit," he exclaimed. He looked around the room seeking a target for his frustration, and his eyes set on her. "Fox, who'd you sleep with to make it onto that list?" Serena refused to dignify his outburst with a response, but it had cut deep. Max stormed out of the room and spent the rest of the morning packing up his things, ignoring anyone who tried to speak with him. "Good riddance, asshole," she thought. She resumed her writing to complete the list. 10. Serena Fox, life support technician. Serena paused as she thought of how to describe herself. The contender. There were 3 spots on offer to join Xanthi, Xavier, and Troy for the simulation hub. Come hell or high water, she would be one of them.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.